All right, and welcome back to Janky AF. Now this is going to be a fun little sit down and chat session. I'm going to give you my bull market list for 2022. We're going to do 10 cars and 5 trucks. We're going to split this into 2 different videos just because it's going to be a little long. So for now, we'll start with the cars. And what I want to say as a baseline is that cars are looked at as investments now. There's a lot of speculators getting in the market, especially on the high end of things. And I think, first of all, you should not look at cars as investments, as I think most car people would tell you. They cost more to maintain themselves or improve them, almost more than any other investment. You have to dump money into cars constantly to keep them in the shape that they are in. But it is a fun exercise. Now, Hagerty just did their bull market list, and shout out to JM on Cars, my favorite YouTuber, car YouTuber, and he did his sort of evaluation of that list, and then he kind of dabbled with making some of his own additions to that list that he would cite as good investments, with the caveat, I think, that he also said that they're just terrible investments. And I think that, here at Janky AF, we kind of pride ourselves at lowering the resale value of every car we buy, which is sort of a joke and sort of true. Even Jay Leno himself, the sort of patron saint of car guys or car people, whenever he's asked what cars would be good investments, he always says, well, I just buy what I like. So, and that's certainly what I do. But with that, let's get into it. This is my bull market list for cars for 2022. First on the list is the Honda Del Sol, made from 92 to 98. And you'll start to see a theme here. A lot of these cars come from the same time period. I think that Classic Car Insurance, speaking of Hagerty, not sponsored by Hagerty, but if they want to give me some money, then I'm open to that. 97, now it's 25 years in New York State anyways. After 25 years, a car can be registered historic, it can be insured as a classic, and then you can get historic or antique license plates, which I think is very cool. Classic car insurance is much cheaper. You decide, with a lot of policies, you decide on the value of the car mutually. It's insured for that much. A lot of times there'll be free 24/7 roadside assistance and towing that comes with your insurance policy. You get the Hagerty magazine in Hagerty's case. So a lot of the cars that I'm picking are from that era because, speaking of having investments, if you have a classic car policy, it's just way cheaper to run just from an insurance standpoint. So with that, the Honda Civic Del Sol, which was actually called the CRX Del Sol in some markets, which is convenient because I think this is a really good comparison to the CRX itself. And if you look at here, you can get a decent example. Now, I've filtered this out for manual transmissions. You can get a decent example. A lot of these are super high mileage, but actually a little pricey, around 10 grand. You can get into like a really nice Civic Del Sol with a manual transmission, less than 100,000 miles. I think these are great cars. I've always loved Del Sols. A friend's uncle had a lime green one when I was growing up, so of course that sort of stuck with me. They are front-wheel drive. They're not a mid-engine, as some people seem to think, because they look like they are mid-engined. But just a great little car, a really zippy car. You're going to get good gas mileage, and these are quite rare. Like looking on car gurus here, there's not too many of them, especially with manual transmissions. So I think that if you are, for some insane reason, looking at this as an investment, I think if you get a nice one and you keep it nice, it's only going to go up as these cars get more and more rare. A great looking car. It's a Honda. It's going to be reliable. Still probably get turns when you go to a Cars and Coffee, because they are, still somewhat rare, despite being made in pretty large quantities. And just a really fun car. You can pretty much daily drive. I wouldn't really want to drive one in the winter too much, but a great car. So that's number 1 on the list. Second, we are going to go to the Infiniti J30. Now, I've always loved the J30 ever since I found out what it was. It has this crazy styling with this like crazy rounded off back section. Now, you can get some of these without the spoiler on them, but most of the ones you find do have that little sort of back spoiler on them. And this is a weird car because it was sort of like a compact luxury sedan or a smaller luxury sedan. These were sold from 92 to 97, so also in that range of years. Made in Japan, which, you know, has a reputation for making good quality things. Very, very beautiful and, you know, supple interiors on them. And I think this would be also, you know, sort of a great daily driver. That's also a classic. It's insanely unique and great wheels too, like a BBS style wheel. I could only find 2 of these that actually had pictures on them, and one was in Massachusetts, which I forget their name now, but I'll try to throw it in here. A shout out to them on Instagram who just posted one that they saw, and it was actually this exact one in Massachusetts. So, you know, you're going to get a lot of uniqueness points. It's an Infiniti, which is Nissan, so it should be, you know, fairly reliable. Parts may be getting hard to find, especially on like trim pieces and stuff like that. Matt Farah from the Smoking Tire did a one take on one of these that was swapped with some big engine, I think like a V8 and a manual transmission, which was like sort of a Frankenstein's monster car. So you could go that route if you really wanted to, and it'd be a good place to start because these are going for $5,000, under $5,000 with 130,000 miles on them. And again, it's going to be a very luxurious ride. I can't imagine your gas mileage is going to be great, but it's not going to be awful. And it's going to be very, very cheap to insure too, because 97, now that we're in 2022, is going to classify for classic car insurance. So I think that's a really great buy if you can find one, and a really, really cool, unique car. And because, again, they're so rare, if you keep it in nice shape, maybe if you do want to sell it, and if you find the right buyer on something like Cards and Bids or Bring a Trailer, you can, you know, maybe get your money back or close to it if you want to move on to the next thing. And speaking of which, now you're going to find on this list a couple of these cars I do own, and maybe it's wishful thinking that I'm trying to promote the value increase of these cars if I ever want to sell them. So it's a coincidence and it's not a coincidence. You know, I say this, I practice what I preach. A lot of cars, some of these cars on this list I have myself bought, so if that's worth anything. The Buick LeSabre, and I'm going to throw kind of in there the Buick Park Avenue. Another one of these was just posted on Instagram, and I had a nice conversation about Park Avenue. On my Buick LeSabre videos, which you're welcome to check out, I'm more coming soon, but I had a great sort of back and forth with a gentleman who had a Park Avenue, and what he was saying is that no one likes to admit that they like Buicks, but everyone kind of secretly does. Buick is a great brand. I think it's like the oldest continuous automotive brand still, you know, in existence and has been running for over 100 years. Hoovie's Garage did a great video on old Buicks. I think he bought a Park Avenue at one time, and it was saying they're just, you know, these like super comfy sort of luxury barges, but unlike, you know, sort of a Grand Marquis or something like that, they're not, or a Cadillac, they're not powered by V8s, they're V6s, they don't have air suspension, so they're more reliable. And with the V6 engine, you hear people getting, you know, over 30 miles a gallon with these things. And I think particularly the 7th generation, which went from 92 to 99, I have a 1995, I think they're really great looking cars. I think they're really underrated. Now I have one in white. I really think the styling has aged well, particularly the pre-facelift version, which has sort of your indicators and your fog lights directly below the taillights instead of this sort of single taillight with the stuff going on in the bumper. I just think they look a little bit more classy, a little bit more old school. These, there's one listed here for $12,000, but you know, for something under 100,000 miles, you're looking at, you know, anywhere from $5,000 to $7,000, which again is a very small price to get into sort of the classic car game. You could even finance that and have around $100, $110, $120 payment if you really wanted to, which is, you know, very, very affordable. The 3800 motor, the 3.8 liter V6 engine, is known to be very, very reliable. Car Wizard did a video on this motor. Now, incidentally, I have had a couple issues with mine, but nothing as major as I thought, and obviously you can watch Janky to find out more about that. But just a really underrated, great car. Now this is a cruiser. This is like a sort of a luxury wagon. Like Buick stands one level below Cadillac, and there's all these rumors that, you know, back in the 50s or whatever, Buick had to actually make their cars worse because they were out competing Cadillac, but they had to be lower in the hierarchy, in the GM hierarchy. And you know, whether that's true or not, but I do think they're just a really, really great car. Now, they did make a ton of these cars. They were like the #1 selling, I think, sedan in their class for a long time, but they're getting harder and harder to find, like all cars from this generation, from this period. The 90s are getting really, really hot right now with cars and bids. 80s and 90s are becoming sort of collector items now, because they're, you know, 20, 25, 30 years old. So that is, you know, I can't speak highly enough about my Buick. I really, really like it. It's just this great supple ride. It has a great stereo system. And it's just, you know, I always preach to people, get a second car, get a little runaround buggy, something if your car has to go in the shop, you can drive around. And I think a Buick LeSabre, particularly 7th generation, or a Park Avenue, which I believe is actually the 1st generation, they went from 91 to, let's see here, to 96. Very, very similar car. Park Avenue is a little longer. It's sort of like the executive, and the LeSabre's a little bit smaller. Still a big car, definitely, but it doesn't feel unwieldy when you're driving. It doesn't feel like you're driving a limousine or anything like that. And especially with SUVs and how monstrous, even like a Honda Civic is nowadays, you might be surprised with how manageable it is when you're in there. But tons and tons of room, comfortable, the whole thing. So that's 7th generation Buick LeSabre. So moving on, let's get a little sporty here. The Corvette C4, and I'm going to sort of slash in the C5. Now, what's interesting is Corvette C4s, I feel like, are finally kind of getting their due. I've seen many, many videos on YouTube where it's like the Corvette C4 is like the best performance bargain you can buy. And of course, Corvettes are known for being performance bargains. Even the C8 is like, you know, your quote unquote poor man's Ferrari. You hear a lot of really good things about the C8 Corvette. And I think the C4 Corvette is somewhat divisive, because it is just sort of bashing you over the head with the 80s. But you're getting really cheap speed, and I think they're great looking. I think it's almost a minimalist approach, especially for what cars look like now. Now, I have filtered out for manual transmissions here because, you know, nothing wrong with an automatic transmission, especially in a sports car. I just reviewed a Honda CRZ, excuse me, a Honda CRZ, and I'm starting a new playlist called Classic Automatics, which is, you know, classic cars that have an automatic transmission. I'm very much a save the manuals person. I love manual transmission cars. But I do think there is something kind of undervalued, or, you know, anytime something is such a huge underdog or hated, I gravitate towards it in sort of a defensive sort of way. So I love an automatic transmission too. But, you know, if I was going to buy a C4 Corvette, I would definitely buy a manual transmission. Now, the 84s had sort of a weird thing going on with their engine, and their fuel injection system, I think, was not super developed at the time, so I would go like really 85 onwards. Now, I love the round taillights, which changed in, I believe, 1991 or 92. But there is a sweet spot, I believe it's like 88 through 90, and someone please check me on that, where you can get the round taillights, but with the updated interior and the new 6-speed manual transmission. So that would be your sweet spot. Now I'm going to talk about the C5 in a second, but you know, the cheapest one I see right here is like $9 grand. Now, if you go on classifieds, this is Car Guru, so this is mostly dealers and stuff. If you go on classifieds, I think you can still find them for like 6, 7, 8 grand for like a decent one, a nice driver. But they are starting to climb up there. So even though it's on the bull market, I think they're probably still on the rise, but they've already climbed a little bit, as all cars have, as we see, and you know, consumer goods at large for that matter. But just a great, great looking car. I love the older style wheels personally. But that's a nice thing too. There's a lot of sort of within this, you know, unified car, there's a lot of different manifestations of it. So if you like the slicer wheels or the more old style wheels, and you know, convertibles obviously, and that's another thing we'll talk about with the Porsche, but the convertibles are always going to be cheaper, which is funny to me, but I get it, because I would kind of prefer a coupe too. It's sort of like the more pure sports car, and usually your rigidity of your car or your frame, your structure is a little bit better. So convertibles are always usually going to be a little bit cheaper. But the C4 Corvette is still, I think it's, you know, again, aging really well. 80s, 90s is very hot right now. And it really is, you know, a performance car. Like the Corvette, ever since, you know, let's say 1955 1955 or 1956, after it sort of got over that 2-year hump of being sort of just like a cruiser, and it started to get manual transmission offerings, bigger engine offerings. I actually went to the Corvette Museum this fall, which I will do another video on, and it's really, really fascinating to see the evolution of the Corvette, but it always was, and I think always will be, sort of an underrated, underappreciated car, despite the mass following that it has. And, you know, there's all these sort of, you know, it's easy to throw stones at the Corvette crowd, like old fat white guys and all that. But that's a lot of sports cars in general, realistically. And I think that, you know, you can have a whole debate on hipsterdom and irony and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, get what you want. And if, you know, it's hard to do better than, you know, an old Corvette. It really is just a really, really cool car, and I think they're timeless. And so I would vote for a Corvette. So talking about the C5 here really quickly. Now it's funny because I thought these were starting to rise in value quite a bit, because I remember a time when you could get these, because I've always wanted one, so I've always looked at them on the classifieds, when you could get these for, you know, around 10 grand, and C4s were going for like 5 for like a driver. So those are going up. But now the C4 is actually approaching C5 status, because here's a, you know, 2011, now it's convertible for 12 grand, a little higher mileage, but we have a 2000 hardtop coupe here for 12.2 with 138,000 miles on it. So it's not much more than a C4. So a C5 might actually be a better bargain nowadays, and it's just more modern. Your electronics and stuff like that are gonna be a little better. Now with these C5s, there is a electronic brake control module that I think 97 through 2000 or 2001, they don't even make the part. You can't find it anywhere. You can't buy it. It costs a ton of money to get it serviced. So that's something to look out for. This is not a buyer's guide, but you know, you probably do want to go towards a later one. So that narrows your window too, and makes them, despite also being a ubiquitous car, makes finding the right one kind of rare. So do your homework if you're actually going to invest in one of these. The C5's looks, now the C5 was like sort of the Corvette of my, you know, teenage years. So for me, the C5 is kind of like, I love the C5, and I feel like it is falling right in this stage where the C4 is like kind of finally hot and finally like appreciated. People love the C6, especially with the Z06 and the ZR1. That is, if you have a little bit more money to spend, really the ultimate performance bargain. I always thought the looks of the C6 were so derivative of the C5 that it didn't really seem original. I also love pop-up headlights, and the C5 was the last Corvette to have that. Now, I'm not a purist that says, you know, Corvettes need to have pop-up headlights, because the original Corvettes did not have pop-up headlights, which everyone forgets. But I love the pop-up headlights. I love the styling of it. And it is sort of derivative of the C4, that's true, but I feel like it's so much more rounded, and it really came into the 90s, and it's very sleek looking. It has this huge rear end. It's still got the round taillights, and again, not a purist, but I do like the round taillights, even though they're more ovals or ellipses in this case. Just a really, really timeless car, and I kind of don't like buying obvious cars in shades of red. I like BMWs and Mercedes in red. I like even like trucks in red. I'm not a huge red sports car guy, but I think the C5 Corvette in torch red is just delicious. It's wonderful. It's a great looking car. And the cool thing about Corvettes too is that a lot of them are targa tops, and I love targa tops, as I'll talk about with a Fiat later on this list. So you kind of get that open air experience, but you still get like a coupe if you want it to be. So a versatile car, you could daily drive this car, and I've even seen videos of people doing engine management. You know, the beautiful thing now about like computers, and it has to be kind of like a little bit more of a modern car, but you can do so much with tuning now that I've seen people do like lean burn tunings on these C5s to get, I think it was legit street cars, I think that's who it was, hopefully I'm getting that right, to get over 40 miles a gallon on the highway. So if you're willing to like sort of get into it, you could actually make this a relatively fuel efficient car, and you're still driving a Corvette, and it's got the great, now this is a fixed roof hardtop, which I like the sort of the hatchback better, but you can even get quite a bit of space back there behind the seats. You could take a dog with you. So great car. And that's another thing I'm kind of stressing, is like a lot of these classic cars, maybe it's your second car, but you still want it to have maybe some practicality to it. You know, you want to actually be able to drive it. But I only see Corvette values going up, especially if you can find a nice one and sort of maintain it and keep it nice. And that's the other thing. I'm janky, so I usually buy the jankiest version, which is a whole nother tangent I'll go on in another video. But as general advice, you really should buy the best one you can afford, because you know, the very simple fact is it's always going to cost you more to restore something to a level of quality that you could simply buy it at. You rarely ever get your money back in terms of fixing up something or restoring it, unless it's some crazy SEMA car or something like that. Some really high-end thing. But generally you want to buy the best one you can afford, unless you don't care about the resale value, which is why as I say, these are investments. You really shouldn't care about it, because then you can personalize it and make it yours. So then you can kind of buy a crappy one and fix it up to your specifications. Maybe you don't care that much about the interior being shredded because you want to, you know, do something crazy or weird with the interior, reupholster the seats to your specification. And if you're okay with the spending the money and not worried about getting it back, then you can actually get in really, really low. And then, you know, after spending several $1,000s or whatever it may be, have something that's like really, really enjoyable to you and really personal and really custom. So, moving on. We are going to talk about the Porsche 996, which is the version of the 911 that was derided for a long, long time. Everyone hated it when it came out, speaking of purists, because it has these like sort of droopy egg yolk lights. They're not perfectly elliptical or round. And there's the famous IMS bearing issue, but you know, all sports cars are going to have maintenance issues, and that's the other thing to keep in mind. If you're hunting, or if you're searching for the perfect car, in terms of being dead reliable, like even my Buick with a 3800 engine is having reliability issues. So you're always going to dump money into these things. But the 911, I heard someone say this the other day. I think it might have been Matt Farah or Doug DeMuro. Can't remember. I apologize. But the Cabriolet version, or the convertible version of these 911s, is the values are still kind of hanging back. Now the 996 is finally getting its due. It's finally starting to appreciate in value, and I wish I had the money to buy one of these 5 years ago when I wanted to, because you could get coupes for like $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 with not crazy high miles, manual transmission. And now the cabrios are sort of, that's like your baseline. Like here's a 1999 with 145,000 miles for 16 grand, and that's basically the floor now. Like that's basically the absolute bottom. Coupes are going for, you know, $4,000 to $5,000 more than that. It's like basically impossible to find a 911 996 coupe with a manual transmission for under $22,000, $23,000. That's the floor, and it used to be, you know, like what this is now. But if you don't care about that, again, like if you're okay with a convertible, and the funny thing is, a convertible car I feel like is often like, you know, something to aspire to, like driving with the wind through your hair. And you know, you see all these British roadsters that are convertibles. But I think if you're more and more into the driving aspect of it, then a coupe has some advantages in terms of rigidity. A lot of people think the coupes look a lot nicer than the cabrios, and I tend to agree with that statement. The 911 is kind of like awkward when made into a convertible, similar to the Volkswagen Beetle, anything that's sort of like a rounded teardrop shape. But if you don't care about it, it's still a really, really great value. Because you're getting the same car just without the roof for, you know, considerably cheaper. Here's a nice black one here. I love these 996. Again, this was the 911 of my teenage years, so I'm naturally like attracted to it, and it will always like hold a special place to me. I always thought the styling on them was great. Now, of course, there's a silver 996 in the opening credits to the remake of Gone in 60 Seconds with Nick Cage and Giovanni Ribisi and Angelina Jolie. That's a great scene in that movie. And so, you know, a really good car. And if you're sort of always wanting a 996 and the market's just like sort of running away with it, well, you could get a convertible version of it and basically get it at the price it was, you know, 4 or 5 years ago for the coupe. So, you know, that's an interesting one. I think not, you know, still like under $30,000 for a Porsche 911 is still like, especially when you see these air-cooled ones going through the roof, it's still probably not a bad time to buy a 996 in general. Moving on. Now, another car that I own is the Fiat X1 9. So the Fiat X1 9 is such a weird, quirky Very forgotten about car in the history of the automobile. It was a mid-engine car. It's often called, or shorthanded as the baby Ferrari, because it's an Italian mid-engine, sort of like wedge-shaped little runabout. And I think it's a great alternative if you're looking at like a Triumph TR6 or an MGB or a Spitfire or any of these like little sort of runabout sports cars that were never really known for speed. They're more about being cheap and having fun with. And I think the X19 is criminally underrated. I've done a video of it, and there'll be more coming soon on this channel. I couldn't even find one of these on Car Gurus. They're so rare now, even though they made them from 74 to 89. And they're out there, but now they're coming on to bring a trailer and starting to get real money. So you had two that were actually sold to the same buyer, one for $27,500 and another one for $29,000. Now that's like the ceiling. Those are like creme de la creme, really amazing condition. And these cars were just never cared for because they were cheap when they were new. So they had no respect, and they were never cared for, and they were, because of that, they were just left to rot and rust. And yeah, they had rust issues, but pretty much every car from the 80s had rust issues. If you are looking at one, of course, definitely buy the best one you can find, which I did not do. But I think at $2,000, I still got a bargain on mine because, it is running now. And so, again, I'm a type of person that wants to customize it a little bit, so I'm not totally worried about it being pristine and original. But if you are buying a car as an investment, you definitely want to keep that in mind. So here we have just some auction results, and you see what these are going for now. It's pretty hard to find a good one under $10,000 now, which even if you go back and bring a trailer 3 or 4 years, these were selling for $5,000-$6,000 for like runners, so they're definitely going up in price. I think the same one, 1981, sold for $8,000, and then a year or two later it sold for $11,000. That's pretty good return on investment if you are buying it as an investment car. The earlier ones seem to go for more, which is interesting because I actually like the later ones better. The later ones had this big US spec bumper, which a lot of people didn't like. I happen to like it. I think it makes the car look longer. And my taste is very unique, I guess you could say. I seem to be in the minority of sort of the taste department sometimes, but that's only more reason to buy what you want to buy. And I think that if you find the one that's less loved or less desired, there could be a lot of bargain at the back end of that. I mean, you take that as a macro, you extrapolate that. A lot of these cars were unloved when they came out, or they were just forgotten. And those are cars that are really starting to gain in value now. So if you want to think of it that way, you're always kind of trying to find the thing that, has gone unrecognized. Just like in any investment, you're trying to find, a low value, buy low. Maybe that's like a hipster mentality, but I digress. So Fiat X19, absolutely wonderful, wonderful car. And even now with the prices at where they are, I'd say it's still a really good time to get into them because they haven't gone through the roof, and they're so hard to find already that if you can find one on the classifieds, which is pretty much the only place you're going to find one other than these auction sites, and you're interested in it, go ahead and buy it up because they're not going to make any more of these, and they're not going to become any easier to find. So moving on. Okay, this is a fun one for me. The first generation Cadillac CTS. Now I actually think this is like a legit good sort of bull list buy, because I feel like the CTS with the new CTS 4 or CT4 Blackwing, I believe it's called, they've changed over from the CTS label now, but that car is like a sensational success. Everyone loves it. And that's like a $120,000 car or whatever. It's brutally fast. Everyone says it's got great handling capabilities. It's like the ultimate sports car because you can track it and it's amazingly fast, but it's also, a 4-seater, and it's got plenty of room in it, and it's well behaved at lower speeds. So I think Cadillac has done a brilliant job of reinventing themselves into like a sort of a performance luxury brand over the last, I guess, 20 years or so. And this is the car that started it all. Now, this CTS was in the second Matrix movie, and I believe it was also in Bad Boys 2. And I forget which of those movies that it was in that they didn't even have the car. I believe it was the Matrix. They didn't even have the car yet. and it was just a prototype, but they had to, you know, get it because they were shooting the movie. But I think this is like, you know, when I'm looking at cars that I think are, one, good investments, and two, just really sort of demarcation lines in automotive history. Within the last 20 or 25 years, I think the Cadillac CTS, there's no better example, excuse me, because it really was sort of, you know, the capstone of a movement. It was a seminal car in what a brand has become for the next 20 years, and done very successfully at that. So the cool thing about the first gen Cadillac CTS, which ran from 03 to 07, so actually not a very long run before they sort of updated it and facelifted it, was you could get this car from the factory with a manual transmission. Now there's very few of these available, and of course, and this is one of my big pet peeves, which I'll also make a video on, a lot of these cars are listed as manuals on the site, and then when you go into them, you look at the picture of the interior, and of course it's an automatic, which to me is like, if you know anything about cars, it's a classic bait and switch, because they're trying to get someone to look at it by enticing them with a manual transmission. And then of course it's an automatic, so I digress. So this particular version, let's see, there's eight Gen 1 CTSs with a manual transmission right now for sale on car gurus. That's like very, very rare. So if you could get one of these with a manual transmission, now everyone complained about the interiors, but you know, the beauty of classic cars is after a certain amount of years, anything looks good, because even if it was like really cheap or crappy at the time, time has a way of making all things great, because they introduce memories and they introduce, oh yeah, do you remember that? And I think also, even though this interior for an upscale car, like you have this all fake wood grain, but it was sort of a sign of the times. And I think also any car that doesn't have like a million screens in it is now desirable just by virtue of that alone. I think it's a very nice interior. I think it's a nice steering wheel, and you could get these with a manual transmission. I believe first it was a in-house 5-speed, and then it went to a 6-speed eventually after that. This looks like a 6-speed. Now this car does have frame damage reported, which, you know, is probably not a great thing, but a really, really great car. And like I said, just a car that symbolized so much for a particular brand of what was to come afterwards. So anytime you can get sort of something that like started it all, of course a big part of cars, maybe the most important part of cars, which I will do another video on, is the story behind them. It's what Jay Leno always talks about. It's what Ed Bolian from VinWiki always talks about, is that the story behind a car is almost more important than anything else when it comes to the actual value of the car. And whether that's the first of something, or the most mileage of something, or the car that had the roughest history of something, it's valuable to people. And I happen to agree. I think the story behind a car is a lot of that car's sort of ambience. And if you're like a car person, you kind of nerd out on these things, it just gives it that much more sort of provenance, and it allows people to connect with the cars. So first gen CTS-V, especially if you can find one, or I'm sorry, and I say CTS-V, but that's a funny slip, because I actually want the base model. Like I want the bottom of the floor CTS, just like the regular one. CTS-V is obviously a very important car, but I like just the standard CTS, because I'm a big fan of like the base model, the lowest version you could get, because I think it's like a baseline for what the company can do at the ground floor without like sort of just adding and adding and adding to it. So CTS-V, I said it again. Hey, we're doing it janky here. Cadillac CTS. The fact that I say CTS-V is probably a good sign for Cadillac, because it's so emblematic of what they're doing as a performance brand now. But Cadillac CTS, first generation manual transmission. Moving on, this is a very similar car actually, and this will be the Jaguar S-Type. Now this S-Type and the X-Type were like the two big Jags that came out after Jaguar came under Ford ownership. And they had this very retro styling, which a lot of people hated. I happen to love it, of course. I thought it was just sort of, I love the retro craze. I mean, and you'll see a lot of these cars through the 90s and 2000s. Spoiler alert, I'm going to put a PT Cruiser on here. The Ford Thunderbird I thought was a wonderful retro car, the Volkswagen Beetle. And it's funny because in sort of a weird time-bending way, by going back in time, they were actually ahead of their time, if that makes any sense. because, you know, as we talk about in movies, like, what is it, sequels and remakes are the big thing, and retro styling you're seeing with all these EVs coming out, like the Volkswagen electric bus is coming out. So retro styling, they were actually ahead of their time by going backwards in time, if you get that. So the Jaguar S-Type, the X-Type now seems like was not reliable, but I've read a lot about the S-Type, and I actually think those Ford engines in there, or maybe they were Jaguar engines, I'm not sure how much engineering crossover was going on between the two companies. But this engine is actually fairly stout and fairly reliable. I've heard a lot of good reviews about these cars, saying they're actually quite underrated. In you know, Jaguars obviously have a horrible reputation for maintenance, right up there with Land Rover, British cars in general, for whatever reason. But I think this styling is great, and I think it's also aged really well. I think it's a extremely unique looking car, and I think it's very distinguishable, which is always a good thing when you're looking for sort of a classic. And these were also offered with a manual transmission from the factory, as you can see here. I mean, you know, you just can't go wrong with the Jaguar interior. They're always great. I think this is a beautiful car, and this is, you know, $9,500, so under 10 grand with 24,000 miles on it. So this is like your cream puff. This is like your ceiling. I'm sure they can be had cheaper if you can find one. So very, very cool car. Look at those green gauges, very beautiful. And I think these are sort of still quite underrated, and now that manual transmissions are becoming rarer and more sought after, any of these cars you can find with a manual transmission, but even one with an automatic would still be a very nice, like, sort of classic car that you could daily drive. It's going to be fairly reliable because it's fairly modern. Your maintenance prices aren't going to be too crazy. So I think the Jaguar S-Type from 2000-2008, great buy on my bull list. Now this is sort of a weird one. I won't be on this too long, but actually a friend of mine, shout out to Julia out in Buffalo, bought one of these, and me and my other buddy, Mr. Schifano, and shout out to him too, and his great Scion XB video that you can watch here. She bought a Lexus CT 200H. Now this is a little hybrid station wagon that Lexus made, and they made it from 2011 to 2017. And I just think this car is one of those cars that's like forgotten, and I think it's really great. Now, you know, 15 grand for a 100,000 mile car that's getting on close to 10 years old doesn't sound like a great value. I'm sure they made a lot of these. So in terms of an investment, I don't know that they'll ever become really like a classic. But in terms of just getting like a really cool car and something that's unique, I think you could take this to a car show, and once you start to talk about it to people, it'd be really interesting. Now, I just reviewed a Honda CR-Z, and I was saying that it was kind of in a class unto itself, and this actually is kind of right there up with it. Now, it's a Lexus, so you're getting Toyota reliability. It has a pretty underpowered engine. You know, 134 horsepower isn't going to, like, you know, blow anyone off the line, but you're getting a combined 42 miles per gallon, which is really good. That's as good as the CR-Z, maybe even better. And you're getting a really, really nice interior. Now, the one that she had, and when I saw this interior, it had these beautiful, like, camel sort of caramel seats in it. Gorgeous interior. You're getting a wagon, which is maybe the one classic appeal it has, is wagons are very hot. You're getting a wagon, a hatchback. It's got, I think, very nice styling. I think it's like a good era for Lexus. This is when the IS300 was around that everyone loves. Great rear end on it, and really cool sort of 2000s interior, very nice. And just a unique car and great gas mileage. This would be a great, great daily driver. So we won't be on that for too long because it's not really like quote unquote a classic, but I think just like a really underrated car that people should pay attention to. So rounding it off at the end here, and then I will do two honorable mentions. The Chrysler PT Cruiser. You heard it here first on the bull market list, Janky, for 2022. The PT Cruiser, I mean, Regular Car Reviews did a very positive review of the PT Cruiser, which is like maybe one of the easiest cars to trash and the most trashed car, the PT Loser and all that. And I think Regular Car Reviews is really smart to do a positive review on it because it was almost too easy for them to make fun of it. Other thing that, and you'll see a theme here, other thing that a lot of people don't know about the PT Cruiser was that it was offered with a manual transmission from the factory. Now here we have a beautiful 05 with only 86,000 miles on it for $6,000, and you're getting a convertible. These PT Cruiser convertibles have really grown on me. I really like that Chrysler did a convertible version of this, and it's got this real long, like sort of 8-ball shifter. I wonder what the action is like on that, but I think this is like a really, really cool car. You know, everything about 90s Chrysler was really, really cool, and like Prowlers, obviously. And speaking of that, there is actually a purple one of these for sale, so which I think is awesome, because it's like, it almost looks like a Prowler. Like, it's so funny to think that you could have like almost like a sedan version of the Prowler. And that's basically what this is. Same color, and even like how the Prowler had the gauges that were the color of the body of the car. This is the same way, so it has the purple gauges, it has your big front spoiler here, and your big grille. I mean, it was the same concept, really, like a 1940s or 1930s hot rod or sedan in this case, with the gray leather. It's like, it's totally Prowler right there, you know. But and you have a manual transmission, which you actually could not get in a Prowler, ironically enough. So this would be a great second car to have, you know, and it's a hatchback, a wagon. It's very practical. I've heard these actually aren't that unreliable. I've heard they're decent. I think, now that I'm thinking about it, I think a convertible with a manual transmission would just be the best summer car ever, and they're cheap. You know, the manual transmissions are kind of hard to find, just because I'm sure most people order them with an automatic. But that being said, they are out there. There's quite a few of them here on Car Gurus. So I think this would be a really, really underrated car. And if you were able to find like a really nice one with not crazy mileage on it, I actually think this would be a good investment. I think you could probably, you know, clean one of these up, get it mechanically sound, and probably flip it on Bring a Trailer if you really wanted to, if you were playing that investment game. And it's very low buy-in, honestly. So there you have it. Honorable mention, really quickly, the Volkswagen New Beetle I had to include on this list. I didn't do any sort of, you know, research on it, but I think that car, again, they made so many of them, but if you could find one that was a manual that was really clean, I think that'd be a really, really cool car. And I'm sort of waiting now, in the next maybe 5 to 10 years, those will start to, like, for really nice ones, people my age will start to get really, really nostalgic for those things. And the other one that I wanted to mention was the BMW Z3. Now, I think you can still get a manual transmission BMW Z3 for just around $5,000-$6,000, which, again, if you finance it, it's like a $97 car payment, you know, to have like a Z3, which is like a legendary, iconic roadster. It was in the James Bond movie, and I think just because they made so many of them, and because the M Roadster, the performance version of it, and obviously the coupes have always been through the roof, but to get a little convertible manual transmission BMW, you can even get one with a little 4-cylinder in it. I don't care about speed, really. I like slow cars. Just a great buy anytime. And maybe it's not a great investment, because finding a really clean one's going to cost you, but just as like a fun car to buy, that's still on my bull market list. So there you have it. This video has been very, very long. I ramble, but if you've somehow made it this far, maybe just listening in your car or doing some work somewhere, thanks so much for checking it out. We'd love if you subscribed. It really, really does help us, and we're such a small channel yet growing that we engage with all our audience, and we love talking with y'all. So we are going to do a trucks version of this, which will be 5 trucks, so it'll be a little bit shorter. We'll get that up soon. But that's my bull market list. I sort of wanted to get into this game of talking about which cars are good investments, and sort of just laugh generally at the idea of cars as investments, as someone who owns cars and invests in them. But that's it. So until next time, Janky do Thanky.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.